In Hebrews 4, verses 9 through 11, it asks a question basically. It's saying, do you have a resting faith? Do you trust in God? Or is your faith a striving faith? It says in verse 9, there remains therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, into God's rest, he has also ceased from his own works, as God did from his. The outward sign of faith is rest. It's peace. Resting faith is always when God moves. I don't strive to try to prove or earn or maintain my salvation. I trust in God. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, I am saved by God's grace through faith, not of myself. It's a gift from God, not of works, lest any man should boast. You don't strive to get saved. You trust in God. John 5:24, Jesus said, if any man hears my words and believes in God who sent me, he has eternal life and will not come into condemnation, but has already passed from death into life. I have peace over my salvation. I have rest in that. We have peace in provision. All the times that God has come through and provided for us financially and in different ways, it's not because we strove and made our efforts count. It's not our effort. Yes, we work, we do things, but God is the one who makes it all work out. And I don't worry, I don't stress over that. Every time we've seen healing or miracles or things like that, it's when we rested and trusted in God's promises and in his word. And then we see him come through. It's never because we strove out of our own effort. Striving faith doesn't produce anything because it's your strength. And your strength and your power is very, very small and limited compared to God. It won't do it. God will. And so when you trust him, you have peace. So let us make every effort, or let us labor or make every effort, therefore, to enter into that rest, to walk by faith, lest any man falls after the same example of unbelief. So in that part, he's referencing back Hebrews 3 and 4. It talks about Israel when they came out of Egypt. God showed the Pharaoh signs. There was 10 plagues. He opened the Red Sea. He delivered Israel through the Red Sea. They left Egypt wealthy. They were born slaves. They left free and rich. And they get to the borders of the Promised Land. This is a promise that was 4 centuries old. 400 years prior, God promised Abraham that he and his descendants would have the land of Canaan. And they were about to receive it. That generation was going to get that promise. And they saw God's hand, and they get to the border of Israel. And they send in 12 spies to check out the land. And 10 of those spies came back and gave an evil report. They said, yeah, the land's beautiful. It's everything we were told. But there's the Nephilim there, these giants, and they're going to eat us. There's these huge walled cities. And the people, the congregation, believed that report, and they all fell into unbelief. They didn't believe that God was going to come through for them. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, they had faith. They said, we've seen God's hand. We know he's there. He's going to give us this land. Let's go in now and take it. But the congregation said, no, we don't want it. And a lot of people are automatically going to assume that means that they lost their salvation, because in Hebrews 3 it says, it goes through saying that they didn't enter into God's rest. And we think, oh, God's rest is heaven. No, in this case, they failed. They didn't lose their salvation. They lost their blessing. They lost their inheritance on this earth, which was the Promised Land. The Promised Land is not an analogy for heaven. I know we make it that. I used to do that too, and I'm sorry, I was guilty of that. The Promised Land is not heaven. The Promised Land had Nephilim and enemies that had to defeat. Is that what heaven's like? Are we going to get to heaven and have to fight a bunch of giants off? No, it's not. They did not lose their salvation. How do you know that? A bunch of reasons. One of them is if you jump to Hebrews 11, it talks about the Hall of Faith. A bunch of men and women in the Bible that did amazing things for God. And they are listed. That same generation that refused to go in the Promised Land is listed in the Hall of Faith in verse 29. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land. And when you get to Hebrews 12, verse 1, it says that they are part of this cloud of witnesses that is looking down on us. So if they are listed in the Hall of Faith, if they are part of the cloud of witnesses, that means they're saved. There's nobody in hell who's listed in the Hall of Faith who's a part of the cloud of witnesses. They did not lose their salvation. God continued to provide food for them, manna, for 40 years. He kept their clothes from wearing out. He gave them victory in battle in Numbers 21, verses 1 to 3, I think it was. He led them by the pillars of cloud at day and fire at night. He did all that. Why would he do that for them if they weren't saved? And they're listed in the Hall of Faith. And God himself even forgave them. When you read this story in Numbers 13 and 14, when you get to 14 verses 19 and 20, Moses says, Lord, please forgive them for their rebellion, their unbelief. And in verse 20, God says, I will pardon them. But he did not allow them to go in the Promised Land. That was the consequence of their sin. Now, There are many blessings. There are many things that God has for us, the rest and peace he has for us, that is ours to take hold of by faith, but we have to walk by faith and trust him. And when you do that, you might be nervous and anxious for a while, but after a while you become confident in God, and it brings peace, it brings rest, and you start to see God come through and fulfill his promises. And you realize it's just the resting faith. It's trusting him. It's believing his word. You do what he calls you to do. You're not being lazy doing nothing. There are times even though where God says, just stand back and watch. I'm going to fight for you. But ultimately, it's an act of faith, a position of your heart. I'm saying I'm willing to trust God. And that brings peace. And I stop striving from my efforts. I start trusting in his power. So going back to Hebrews 4, verses 9 through 11, there remains therefore a rest to the people of God. There's always some measure of rest that we can have in this life when we're willing to trust God by faith. Are you entering into that? For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works. You're not striving out of your own effort anymore, as God did from his. Let us labor or make every effort, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man falls after the example of unbelief. Because what happens when you don't believe God? You don't take hold of his promises. If you don't believe God, you're not going to take hold of his promise for salvation. If you don't believe, and you're going to be striving out of religion and your good efforts to try to make your way into heaven, and it won't work. If you don't believe God for provision, you're going to strive and work and try to earn money to provide for yourself instead of trusting that he'll come through and provide for you. If you don't trust God for like healing or deliverance or miracles or whatever it is, then you're going to be striving out of your effort and your wisdom and the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of men to try to figure this out instead of trusting in God. And when you trust in yourself, there's no peace. It's always striving and anxiety and worry and fear and doubt. But when you trust in God, it brings peace, it brings rest. And you might have some anxiety and a bit of nerves when you go through that because you're learning to walk by faith. You're learning to walk. It's a new thing. But as you get used to it, it actually brings so much peace. It brings so much peace. So are you ceased from your own striving? Or are you trusting in God? Or are you still going out of your own effort? Just make sure I think I got through everything I wanted to cover here. But all the things that God has for us, all his promises, his blessings, just like Israel had the opportunity to receive the blessing of the promised land and the peace and the rest that would come. And they had to do some work. They had to clear it out and everything. But God promised that he was with them. And they forfeited that blessing because they didn't have faith. Are there blessings, callings, ministry, whatever it is that God has for you that you're forfeiting because you're unwilling to trust him by faith and to walk by faith? Think about that. Everyone has to answer that for themselves. But ultimately, all of us as Christians, we all have that measure of rest and peace and blessing that God has for us that we aren't taking a hold of if we don't walk by faith. So be introspective, check your own heart. I hope this is an encouragement to you guys that there is always that rest for God's people if you're willing to take it by faith. I pray this is a blessing to you guys. I pray it helps. I thank you guys for watching. Have a great week and God bless.